Tonight, the Jefferson Literary and Debating Society, now in its 187th year of perpetual existence, is both pleased and proud to announce the fourth speaker in our weekly speaker series for the fall semester of 2011, Mr. Stephen Frantz. Mr. Frantz will present a speech entitled, The Cost of Nothing. A double who, Mr. Frantz received his Bachelor of Science in Nuclear Engineering with highest distinction in 1976 and his law degree in 1979. Mr. Frantz was himself a member of the Hall, serving as probationary chairman in the spring of '76 and president of the Society in the spring of '79. Hall Law. Mr. Frantz is an attorney in the DC office of Morgan, Lewis & Bacchus, a global law firm and one of the nation's leading energy law practices, where he's been a partner since 1994. A respected energy attorney, Mr. Frantz has been a trailblazer in the field of nuclear regulation and certification of nuclear power plants. He assisted General Electric Company in securing the first design certification ever issued by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. He served as lead counsel for Exelon in connection with securing the first early site permit, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's prerequisite for building a power plant, which included a successful argument before the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. Mr. Frantz is a Band 2 Chambers-ranked nuclear attorney. For all of the non-lawyers in the Hall, that means that he's one of the top 10 nuclear regulation and litigation attorneys in the world. He assisted the Nuclear Energy Institute in developing the framework for implementing the construction and operation permit regulations from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. He has represented utility companies from California to Florida before the NRC, including the license renewal of the Peach Bottom Nuclear Plant in Pennsylvania. The Jefferson Society is indeed honored to host such a distinguished individual this evening. We are always pleased to have one of our own, no less than former president, back in the hall. Please stand and join me in welcoming Mr. Stephen Frantz.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. It's great to be back at the university, especially back in the home. Some of my best experiences in life occurred here at the university. I met my wife here, and as Phil mentioned, I got 2 degrees here, which have now formed the basis for my career. I met all of my best friends here at the Hall, not just my best friends in college, but my best friends in life. We still get together regularly and drink and debate, and we go on vacations together. Also, many of my fundamental beliefs were developed here in the Hall through my interactions with the Hall members. I know about 10 couples where both spouses were former Hall members. In fact, I know 3 members of the Hall who married another Hall member, got divorced, and then married another Hall member. I guess they didn't get it right the first time. But in the case of my good friend Pamela Friedman, I guess it's fair to say she did get it right the second time.
Collect the whole set.
Additionally, 2 of my friends from the Hall got married, had children, one of whom came to the university and became vice president of the Hall. I'm referring to Edward Ridgely, who you may all know. Outside of the members of my own family, the people I met here in the Hall have meant the most to me in life. So my admonition to you is to cherish these moments. Your friendships and your experiences here in the Hall will carry forward for you the rest of your life. Tonight, I would like to discuss the concept of risk, how we evaluate risk, how we judge its acceptability, and how we regulate risk as a government. In particular, I will focus on the risk of nuclear power, a topic which I know well. In general, Americans accept relatively high risk for common day events. In contrast, for relatively low probability events with high consequences, we are very risk intolerant. Essentially, we're afraid of the unknown. I would like to provide you with 2 examples of this. The first is 9/11 and the terrorist attacks that occurred then. And the second is the events in Japan earlier this year with the tsunami and the subsequent meltdown of some of the reactors at Fukushima. 9/11 itself was horrific. There were approximately 3,000 American deaths on that day. In the aftermath of the attack, I believe our country went a little bit crazy. The risk that any of us are going to be a victim of a terrorist attack is essentially nil. Even on 9/11, the death rate was approximately 1 in 100,000 Americans. Despite the small risk, our government has gone to extraordinary lengths to help prevent another terrorist attack. We have launched 2 wars. Those wars have already cost Americans around 5,000 to 6,000 lives, almost double which occurred on 9/11. We've already spent around $1 trillion, and we'll probably spend another $2 or $3 trillion as we care for our brave soldiers who are fighting in those wars. And finally, and probably most importantly, we have surrendered part of our civil liberties, all in the name of preventing further terrorist attacks. Given this, I think it's appropriate to ask whether the cost has been worth the benefits, whether it's better to, in fact, incur a slightly higher risk of terrorism than to pay these extraordinary costs. Turning to Japan, the death toll from the earthquake and the tsunami was approximately 25,000 people. Entire towns were wiped away. There were railroads along the coast that were washed away. And despite this devastation, much of the focus of the media has been on the accidents at the Fukushima nuclear power plant. 3 of those reactors did in fact have a partial meltdown, releasing substantial amounts of radiation. However, only 2 people died at Fukushima, and both of those were from the tsunami and not from radiation. Thus, when looking at the risks of the events in Japan, we have to ask, what was the greater risk? The risk of an accident at the nuclear power plant, or the risk of living in a seaside town, or riding in a train along the coast? Almost everyone would point the finger at the nuclear power plant and say that that's the greater risk. However, when you look at the deaths that occurred in the towns and along the trains, they were obviously far higher and they posed a far higher risk. You may say that those deaths occurred from natural causes. Actually, there was as much human cause there as natural cause. We could have located the towns and the trains and the nuclear power plant all above the tsunami flood level. We chose not to. We thought the benefits of locating along the coast were greater than the potential risks. And undoubtedly, the towns and the trains will all be rebuilt in essentially the same location. Again, we perceive that the benefits are worth that potential risk. We can't say the same thing for nuclear power. Based upon the accident in Fukushima, the Japanese, the Germans, the Italians, and the Swiss have all decided that they will not build any further nuclear power plants. Additionally, the Germans have decided to close their existing operating nuclear power plants. They perceive the risk to be unacceptable based upon Fukushima. However, the reality, I believe, is quite different. No one has ever died from radiation from an accident at a nuclear power plant site in the United States. As I mentioned before, no one died from radiation at Fukushima. In fact, the only deaths from radiation from an accident at a nuclear power plant occurred at the Chernobyl plant in the former Soviet Union in 1986. That accident resulted in 30 deaths, all to workers who were trying to put out the accident, not to members of the public. Additionally, it is estimated that there may be several hundred people who may have subsequently died in later years due to exposure to radiation and possibly cancer caused by that. Viewed objectively, the risks of nuclear accidents at any site in the United States are small. The U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission has stated that as a goal, that nuclear power plants should not have a risk of a severe accident resulting in a substantial release of radiation of greater than 1 in a million per year. And despite this very small risk, there are still many in the United States who perceive it as being too great. However, I believe it's important to point out that risk is small compared to the everyday risks we see in our lives. For example, the risks of dying in an automobile accident are approximately 1 in 10,000 per year. You may argue that that risk is a voluntarily incurred risk. We're not forced to ride in automobiles. But of course, that's unrealistic in our society. It's unavoidable to ride in automobiles. But let me grant you that. Let's assume that it's a voluntary risk. Let me give you an involuntary risk. That you, as a pedestrian, are walking along the sidewalk and are struck and killed by an automobile. That risk is around 1 in 100,000 per year, or 10 times the risk of a large accident at a nuclear power plant. And yet no one is afraid of walking along the streets. Let me also discuss some other risks that you accept every day here at the university, or almost every day, I'll put it that way. Drugs, alcohol, and sex. About 1 in 10,000 Americans die each year from drugs. And that's both legal and illegal drugs. Similarly, about 1 in 10,000 Americans die each year from alcohol-related causes. And yes, you guessed it, around 1 in 10,000 Americans die each year from sexually transmitted diseases. For those women in the audience, you have an additional risk, the risk of pregnancy. Around 1 in 10,000 pregnancies result in the death of the mother. All of these risks we accept, and we accept without really thinking about them. And yet they're all around 100 times greater than the risks of an accident at a nuclear power plant. Therefore, I suggest that if you want to give up nuclear power because of its high risks, you should also be willing to give up drugs, alcohol, and sex. Obviously not suggesting that you do so. The benefits of alcohol, drugs, and sex are simply too great. But by the same token, you shouldn't be prepared to give up nuclear power. If you're still not convinced, let me offer a few more statistics to put this all into perspective. There are some risks of death which are equivalent to the risk of a large accident at a nuclear power plant. For example, the following causes of death all have a probability of around 1 in a million per year. The risk of death from tripping and falling. The risk from drowning in a bathtub. The risk of accidental suffocation in bed. And the risk of obstruction of breathing due to eating of food. So if you're willing again to give up nuclear power due to its risks, you should be willing to give up walking, bathing, sleeping, and eating. Now again, I'm not contending that you do so. There are many benefits from walking, eating, sleeping, and drinking. However, I would also contend that the risks of nuclear power are the benefits of nuclear power are also worth those risks. Nuclear power is environmentally benign and emits almost no greenhouse gases. It is also a provider of low-cost electricity and has been one of the most reliable sources of electrical power. Therefore, when comparing the benefits of nuclear power versus the risks, I believe that the scale is definitely tipped in favor of nuclear power. But you may ask, why take any risks with nuclear power? Why can't we do without nuclear power entirely? Why not do nothing rather than rely upon nuclear power? And this is certainly within the realm of possibility. Obviously, human beings have survived for millennia on this planet without nuclear power plants. However, in today's society, electricity is essential to everything we do. From work to recreation to obtaining the essentials in life, such as preservation of food, heating and cooling, and communication. Therefore, in our country, we cannot maintain our standard of living without electricity. You might argue that we could do without nuclear power if we conserve more. For those of you who have been in Europe, you realize that they conserve far more than we do, but there's a reason for that. Their cost of power is twice the cost of our power here in the US. So it makes economic sense for Europeans to conserve more than we do. More to the point, conservation has never generated 1 watt of electricity. Conservation generates no power at all. Therefore, if you want electricity to power your TVs, your computers, your air conditioning, and the lights here in Jeff Hall, we need some means of generating power. So again, the question is, what are the alternatives to nuclear power? Wind and solar power are not viable alternatives. Nuclear power operates 24 hours a day, essentially every day of the year. It generates what's called baseload power. In contrast, wind and solar do not generate power continuously, and in fact are highly unreliable. There is also no large-scale facility for storing the energy produced by wind and solar. So therefore, we can't use the wind and solar, store the energy to produce power when the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining. This is not to say that there's not a place for wind and solar in our mix of generating resources. I think there is. However, that is not as an alternative to nuclear power, but instead as a supplement to nuclear power. Currently, there are only a few alternatives for producing baseload power. One is hydroelectric power, and then the second major one is fossil fuel plants. However, we have developed essentially all the large-scale hydroelectric sites in the United States. So therefore, unless you want to dam the Colorado River and flood the Grand Canyon, we are not going to see any more dams built in this country. Turning to fossil fuel plants, coal, of course, is very dirty. Furthermore, all forms of fossil fuel plants emit greenhouse gases. Approximately 40% of all carbon dioxide generated in the United States comes from fossil fuel electrical plants. If you are concerned about global warming, therefore, you should be concerned about using these sources of power. Nuclear power does not have this problem, and therefore makes sense in terms of trying to mitigate the impacts of global warming. I might also add that, as I said before, nuclear power is relatively inexpensive. Currently, the operating maintenance costs for nuclear power plants run around 2 cents per kilowatt hour. In contrast, for fossil fuel facilities, it's about double that or more, about 4 cents per kilowatt hour. If you were to convert or drop all nuclear power plants and instead use fossil fuel facilities, you'd be costing our economy about $16 billion a year. And possibly up to $100 billion if we need to construct new fossil fuel facilities. In turn, this economic cost translates into a risk of premature death, an increased risk of premature death. There's a direct correlation between wealth and longevity. On the average, the wealthier the country is, the longer its populace lives. A country with greater wealth can afford better food, better medical care, and a cleaner environment. Simply stated, the actions that deplete a country's wealth are risky to the health of its populace. The U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, however, does not consider any of these factors in deciding whether or not to issue a license for a new nuclear power plant. Instead, it only considers whether the plant is safe, not the cost of foregoing nuclear power. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission does not consider the cost of doing nothing. I wish I could say the same about the government's approach to other potentially risky activities. Unfortunately, I can't. For example, our regulation of drugs by the Food and Drug Administration delays the marketing of new drugs by years. That in turn drives up the cost of the drugs and, more importantly, deprives individuals of drugs that might be able to save their lives. However, again, the FDA gives no weight to those factors. In other words, the FDA does not consider the cost of doing nothing. Now, this is not to say that I oppose all regulation designed to promote the public health and safety or to protect the environment. On the whole, I believe regulation has benefited our country. However, there are many individual regulations which I believe are not cost beneficial, and that we as a society should not undertake to regulate. Regardless of what risk you may posit, whether it be the risk of offshore drilling of oil, the risk of genetically modified food, the risk of vaccination, I would argue that it is never appropriate to consider the risks in isolation. Instead, it's always appropriate, I believe, to compare those risks versus the everyday risks we face in society. If the risk of an action is less than the everyday risks, we should go ahead and take the action without fear. In the alternative, we should evaluate the costs and benefits of an action and determine whether doing nothing may actually be worse than the risk of taking the action. In many cases, I believe you will find that that doing nothing entails its own set of risks and own set of costs. That the cost of nothing is far too high. If the government would simply recognize this basic truth, it would be taking the very first step to rational regulation. Thank you very much.
Nuclear power and a nation's international prestige and reputation.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the rest of it.
And what do you find to be the relationship between a nation and, or a nuclear power and a nation's prestige and international reputation?
I think it's fair to say that all major developed countries have nuclear reactors. This is both in the Western world and obviously in China, and it's becoming more so in the developed world. I'm not sure that prestige has much to do with it. It's more of necessity. Countries like Japan, who have now announced a moratorium on new plants, really have no alternatives in my mind. They don't have the resources to generate power through other means. And so I think the same thing is going to be true of China. China's probably going to be building more nuclear reactors than the rest of the world combined. It's because they don't have much choice. They can burn coal, which is very damaging to the environment, or they can build nuclear power. And they've chosen nuclear power.
Thank you very much for coming out again. This was very enjoyable. We always talk about what happens when the fossil fuels run out. Uranium is something that we dig out of the ground, and I have heard that, you know, we have dug a lot of it out of the ground already. I was wondering what your sense was, how long our earthly supply of uranium will last, and if that will be a stopping point for building more nuclear power plants.
I don't think it will. We have this incredible amounts of uranium, and as a last-ditch effort, you can also mine the oceans. There's a lot of uranium in the ocean water. So I think we have hundreds of years worth of uranium. We also, by the way, have probably hundreds or more years of coal. We have huge amounts of natural gas resources, so nuclear is not the only alternative. But of course, coal and natural gas, I believe, are more dangerous to the environment.
Thank you very much for your talk. I was just wondering, do you think some of the risk aversion that people domestically in the United States, for example, feel towards nuclear power is a sort of existential threat it poses? Because as the world looks more towards nuclear energy, we engage in bilateral talks, peaceful nuclear assistance, the propensity for proliferation does increase, things like that. So do you think that that has anything to do with some of the skepticism surrounding nuclear energy that you don't see in other sectors?
Possibly, but it's all backwards. Of course, people develop atomic bombs before they develop nuclear power in general. That certainly was true in our case. It was true in the case of the Russians. It was true in many other cases. It's true in the case of the Iranians, where they want to develop their bomb before they perhaps even have nuclear reactors for commercial purposes. So that's what I typically see, is that the bombs come first and then the nuclear power reactors.
Why do you think we are more risk averse about nuclear power than let's say living on the coast? What do you think scares us about nuclear power?
Because it's, most people do not understand it. It's not an everyday activity in their lives. What you find, though, for people who actually live in a neighborhood of a nuclear power plant, they tend to be more pro-nuclear. They are realizing that it's safe and that there are many benefits to be gained. And so it's people who aren't familiar with nuclear power, who don't live in the neighborhood, who tend to be the most antagonistic toward nuclear power.
Thank you so much for being here. I really enjoyed your speech. Very informative. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the nuclear waste that comes out of the back end of this.
Yes.
And how toxic those chemicals are, and we don't really have a means of dealing with those chemicals, maybe that is through a lot of people's fears.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And the problem there is not a problem of technology, it's a problem of politics. We, in fact, as a government, decided about 20 years ago to build a high-level nuclear waste repository at Yucca Mountain in Nevada, which is basically in the middle of nowhere. There's not a large town within 90 miles of the place. And in fact, the Department of Energy submitted an application for a license for that facility. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission reviewed it and was ready to approve it when the Obama administration pulled the plug. And pulled the plug not based upon science, as you may have heard, but instead based upon politics. Senator Harry Reid, the majority leader in the Senate, comes from Nevada, and he opposed the project. And because of that politics, Obama killed Yucca Mountain. Otherwise, I think we would have the facility ready and available probably in 5 to 10 years. Yes?
This is a little bit of a follow-up question. Could you talk about how exactly Yucca Mountain will work as far as transporting the chemical waste, the nuclear waste from different places around the country, and how they can bring it through Las Vegas, how that would be it?
Yeah, in general, when you transport nuclear fuel, spent nuclear fuel, it's highly radioactive. And so you need a lot of shielding just to prevent people nearby from getting lethal doses. And so the fuel is actually located inside these huge concrete casks, which reduce the radiation levels to almost nothing on the outside. Also, because these are mammoth structures, they can withstand accidents, including train accidents. And so what would be done if we had a repository is to load the spent fuel in these huge concrete casks, put them on trains, and run them out to Nevada. You're right, we'd be taking this, for example, from the East Coast out to Nevada, basically all the way across the country. But again, given the fact that they're in these huge concrete storage casks, I see essentially no risk at all from that. Yes?
Hey, for speaking with us. My question is, what would you say to the argument that we should forego any investment in fission in favor of waiting until commercially viable fusion is developed?
Yeah, it's interesting because I have a meeting coming up on Tuesday on fusion power, and people who want to develop fusion reactors. And I thought I would never see that in my career. And I probably still will not, but at least I hope to begin some of the works of my younger associates to carry on after I'm gone. It just takes too long. When I was here at nuclear engineering school at the university, we were told by our professors that there'd be a commercial fusion plant probably around the turn of the century. Well, we're well past that, and there's nothing in sight. We do have some experiments that have reached a break-even point on terms of the amount of power being produced versus the amount of power being put in, but it's for fractions of the second. So we are not even close yet, I don't believe, to a viable commercial fusion facility. We need something in the interim, and the something that needs is fission power. Yes.
Thank you so much for coming in. Sorry about this here. But what do you think, as a member of the industry, what is the best way to convince people of the fact that these risks aren't as great as we think they are? What's the best way for the nuclear industry to go forward to say nuclear power is the future?
Yeah, I think there are some people who will never be persuaded. For some people, many environmentalists, it's almost a faith-based reaction against nuclear power. But for the average person, I think the best way to persuade them is to have people who actually live in the neighborhood of the nuclear power plant get up and talk, get them on commercials, take them out on the road and let them speak. Again, it's the people who live with this every day of their lives who are perhaps the most persuasive salesmen for nuclear power.
Thank you, very, very interesting speech. With a lot of the nuclear power plants in the country predating 3 Mile Island, do you think that the maintenance or the age of the nuclear power plants in America increases the risk of disaster?
No. If it does, it's trivial. Every plant has to go through a very rigorous maintenance program. To get a renewal of a license, they have to go through even further maintenance programs. They periodically replace components that are old and outdated. And so I believe that these plants can continue to operate for 60, 80, perhaps even longer years. In fact, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has approved around 30 or 40 license renewals, 20-year license renewals for existing plants. So most of the industry now will be operating at least for 60 years, and I think, again, probably even longer than that.
Thank you so much for coming. It was a fascinating speech. By making sort of the connection between wealth and longevity within the nation, it seemed to me that sort of the implication was that there's sort of an ethical imperative to choose the economically feasible option. And so the government was sort of the actor, as I saw it here in this situation. I was just wondering if you felt like there was a similar obligation for the individual to avoid doing nothing, and if nothingness as an individual, instead of from a government perspective, has a moral value.
As an individual, of course, you're free to choose whatever you want to do. And it may be rational, it may be irrational. As long as you don't harm anybody else, you should be free to do it. In terms of rational action, I believe it is appropriate to look at what the costs and benefits are. Not so much because you want to make the earth a better place, but just in terms of improving your own lives. If you can take an action that's beneficial on the whole, well, why not? But again, individuals are free to take either rational or irrational actions, and that's their choice. I won't try to persuade anybody or force anybody to take a rational action.
Thank you very much for your speech. I was wondering if you can comment on what the nuclear energy industry can do to, if there is room for improving safety standards, so as to convince the public that the way forward is nuclear energy. Thank you.
I think there is room. In fact, if you look at the NRC regulations, Nuclear Regulatory Commission regulations, since I became a lawyer, when I first became a lawyer in 1979, the regulations were about that thick. They fit in 1 volume. They're now that thick in 2 volumes. And so the NRC does add to its regulations. In many cases, though, I believe they are unnecessary. They impose costs which aren't really cost inefficient. In other cases, they have been very helpful. If you look at the safety record of nuclear power plants since the accident at 3 Mile Island, you're going to see that the plants today operate about 10 times more safely than plants did back then. Back in the 80s, for example, you had a lot of reactor scrams, which are basically automatic shutdowns. You have almost none of that. And these scrams can be potentially dangerous because whenever you have a perturbation in the plant, there's something that can go wrong. And the same thing is true for other safety systems. They operate much more reliably today than they did back in the 80s. And so part of that is due to economics. As the electrical markets deregulated, people had an economic incentive to make their plants more reliable. Part of it's due to regulation. And so I have to give the NRC some credit here, but I think they've gone overboard. One good thing the NRC has done is set goals. As I said before, one of their goals is the risk of a large accident at a nuclear power plant should be 1 in a million per year. That's a wonderful goal. But oftentimes, when they pass the regulations, they don't measure the new regulation against those goals. Instead, they respond to public pressure or other perceived needs. We're seeing that right today. As a result of the Fukushima accident, the NRC will be imposing regulations in probably a half-dozen new areas. They have yet to go through a cost and benefit analysis. They have yet to compare those actions against their own goals. Instead, they're responding to public pressure. Yes.
Thank you, Ben. I wanted to ask, are there any comparable risks with gas or coal power that maybe as the public we're not aware of that would make us more amiable to nuclear power?
Not in terms of, let's say, the worst case accident. You know, the worst case accident with a natural gas plant would be an explosion, but for the most part, that's going to affect a relatively small area. If you look at, say, chronic releases, though, from coal plants, they are extremely dirty, and that will lead to long-term health problems. Increased cancer risks, increased risks of asthma, and so forth. Those risks are something we should account for. They're far higher, of course, with coal plants than they are with nuclear power plants, or wind or solar, for that matter. So I think it is appropriate to consider those other risks. But obviously, with the possible exception of hydroelectric facilities, where you might have a dam that breaks and washing away downstream towns, With that possible exception, I don't think there's anything else that has quite the worst case scenario as nuclear power is.
So thank you again for getting back to all this evening. Yeah, two questions. The first was, what do we currently do with nuclear waste in light of the fact we don't have, for example, the economic facility? And second, what are the hoops that the organization has to jump through to get a nuclear power plant approved and built?
The first question is, right now, for the most part, it's being stored at the reactor sites. Each nuclear power plant has a large pool that's around 20 to 30 feet deep, and the spent fuel taken out of the reactor is stored at the bottom of these pools. Unfortunately, we always had believed that by now we'd have a repository, we'd be taking the fuel out. We don't, and so the fuel pools are being filled. So what plants have done is now get these huge concrete containers that I mentioned. They're putting those on the reactor site and putting the older fuel in those concrete containers. And that's how they're being stored at 100 places in the United States. With respect to your second question, it's about a 12 or 13-year process to go from making a decision to construct and actually getting the license and finishing construction. It's about a 1-year process to evaluate whether or not to go ahead, a 2-year process to actually develop the license application, which is around 8,000 pages long, 4 to 5 years to go through the regulatory review by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and another 4 to 5 years to construct and test the reactor. So what you're seeing, by the way, is right now, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission taking as long to review and approve the plant as it takes to construct the plant. And that's causing, again, around a 12-year cycle, which means that unless you're truly committed, and a lot of plants never make it to the finish line. It's just too long of a process. Okay, thank you very much.
Again, we want to thank you for being here tonight, and as a token of our appreciation, we have for you Jefferson Cup, graded with your name in this semester series.
Thank you very much. Really, it's my pleasure.
Motion for 5 of business.
Any objection?
Take care of this camera. Who's in charge of it?
And you just have to show off.
Who's in charge of the camera? I just. Oh, yeah. I can't move it, so we will do. Well, I can.
Yes. The email.